In the spring of 1968, in the flooded canal country of the Mekong Delta, a Viet Cong ambush party watched a patrol move toward them through the mud. It was small, 6 men, maybe 7. Not the noise they were used to, not the 40-man American infantry platoon that announced itself a quarter-mile out with radios and boot sounds and cigarette smoke drifting through the reeds. These men made no sound at all. Their faces were painted green. Some of them wore blue jeans instead of jungle fatigues, and the weapons in their hands were short, ugly, and unfamiliar. Pump shotguns, cut down, modified. To the men waiting in the tree line, it looked like the easiest kill of the war. A handful of Americans, isolated, outnumbered 10-1, walking straight into the trap. So they opened fire. And in the space of about 15 seconds, they understood the mistake they had made. Nobody had told them what these men were. Nobody had warned them that the United States Navy had built a unit for exactly this water, this dark, this range. They had not ambushed a lost patrol. They had ambushed a SEAL squad. And the men with the green faces were about to teach them why the enemy had already started calling them exactly that. To understand how 6 men could break a force 10 times their size, you have to understand the ground they fought on. The Mekong Delta was not a battlefield in any sense a conventional soldier would recognize. It was water. More than 2,000 miles of rivers, canals, and mangrove swamp laced together into a maze where the land itself dissolved into the tide twice a day. Whoever controlled the waterways controlled the region, and for most of the war, after dark, that meant the Viet Cong. The big American sweeps did not work here. A rifle company moving through the paddies could be heard long before it arrived. The VC simply melted into the canal grass, waited, chose their own moment, and hit the column where it was weakest. Then they were gone before the Americans could bring their firepower to bear. The Americans owned the day. The night belonged to Charlie. The Navy's answer was not more men. It was fewer. In 1962, the first SEAL teams, sea, air, and land, were commissioned, and by 1966 they were operating in the Rung Sat Special Zone, a black tangle of mangrove roughly 7 miles south of Saigon that the Vietnamese called the Forest of the Assassins. It was there, on the 19th of August 1966, that the war stopped being an exercise. Radar Man Second Class Billy Machin was walking point for a SEAL Team 1 patrol when he saw the ambush a half-second before it triggered. He fired first. His shots warned the men behind him, and the same burst that saved them killed him. Machin was the first SEAL to die in combat. His body was pulled out under helicopter fire. The lesson his death wrote was simple, and it never changed. In this country, the man on point lived or died in the first 2 seconds of contact. Everything came down to who could put steel into the enemy fastest, at the shortest possible range. And that is where the shotgun came in. The weapon most people picture in Vietnam is the M16. But the SEAL who walked point in a canal, close enough to smell the enemy, often carried something older and far more brutal. The Ithaca Model 37, a 12-gauge pump shotgun, first built by the Ithaca Gun Company of New York in 1937, from a design that traced back to the great American gunmaker John Browning. It had one feature that mattered more than any other in the Delta. It loaded and ejected from a single port on the bottom of the receiver. The sides were sealed shut. Mud, silt, and canal water, the things that choked every other weapon in that country, had nowhere to get in. A left-handed man could fire it as fast as a right-handed one. Either of them could fire it around the correct side of cover. At contact range, its effect was not a wound. It was an erasure. The SEALs pushed the weapon further. Many of their Ithacas were fitted with a device called the duckbill, a spreader choke that flattened the shot pattern into a wide horizontal fan instead of a tight circle. Roy Boehm, the first officer in charge of SEAL Team 2 and an unapologetic lover of the shotgun, described what a load of No. 4 buckshot did through a duckbill at 20 meters. It laid down a pattern about 2 feet high and 12 feet wide. One trigger pull did not hit a man. It swept a section of trail. Chief James Watson, a plank owner of SEAL Team 2, a point man across 3 tours, cut his Ithaca down, extended the magazine to 7 rounds, screwed on a duckbill, and named the gun Sweetheart. He said flatly that 20 yards was long range for the fights he used it in. Most of them were closer than that. Close enough that the shotgun did not need to be aimed so much as pointed, and whatever was in front of the muzzle simply stopped being a threat. Here you have to be honest, because the men who watch this know their weapons. You will hear it said that the SEALs fired these shotguns by holding the trigger down and just working the pump, the trick called slam fire, which the old Model 37s could do because they had no trigger disconnector. Mechanically, that is true. As a combat method, it is a myth. Kevin Dockery, the historian who cataloged the SEALs' weapons and interviewed the men who carried them, never found a single SEAL who slam-fired an Ithaca in the field. They called it a good way to waste ammunition and hit nothing. What they actually trained to do was harder and deadlier. One aimed shot, one pump, one body, repeated faster than you would believe a man could work a slide. They got their first real proof of what the small squad could do in May of 1967. A young lieutenant named Richard Marcinko took 7 men onto Iloilo Island, deep inside Viet Cong ground, for 11.5 hours. They found a VC first aid station, killed the men holding it, hauled out captured Chinese rifles and a stack of enemy documents, and destroyed the sampans. 7 men. The Navy would later call it the most successful SEAL operation in the entire Mekong Delta. It was the beginning of an idea, that the right 7 men, in the right water, were worth a company. Marcinko would test that idea again the following year, and the second time, it very nearly killed him. Because a SEAL ambush, when it worked, did not look like a battle at all. Picture the method the way the men who ran it described it. A squad slides off a boat at last light and vanishes into the water. They move for hours through canals up to their chests, keeping to the water on purpose, because the banks are seeded with booby traps and the water is not. Nobody speaks. When a sampan drifts past close enough to touch, every man goes still and lets it pass. They reach a bend in the canal the intelligence said the enemy uses, and they settle into the mud, and they wait. An hour, 2, insects, the smell of rot, and then movement on the trail, not 1 or 2 men, but a file of them, unhurried, certain they own the night. The SEALs let the whole column walk into the killing zone, all of it. They do not fire at the first man. They wait until there is no one left outside the trap, and then, on a single signal, 6 weapons open up at once, at a range of a few yards, and the duckbill shotguns sweep the trail end to end. It does not sound like a firefight. It sounds like the world tearing in half. 10, 12 seconds of that, and then nothing. And then 6 or 7 men melting back into the dark before anyone on the other side has understood what happened. That was the whole trade. Not firepower for its own sake. Surprise, delivered at a range where surprise was fatal, by men who had made themselves invisible on ground everyone else had written off to the enemy. Daryl Young, a SEAL who ran with Detachment Golf along the Bassac River in 1970, put more than 100 of those missions behind him in a single deployment. Canal after canal, night after night, the same silent insertion, the same patient wait, the same few seconds of violence. His platoon did that work for 6 months in some of the worst country in the Delta and did not lose a man. That statistic is the whole argument in one line. It was not luck. It was a method, applied by disciplined men, over and over, until the enemy simply stopped being able to guess where the green faces would come from next. In May of 1968, Marcinko learned exactly how far that trade could be pushed. He was back in country as officer in charge of 8th Platoon, SEAL Team Detachment Alpha. On the 14th of May, he led a squad-sized patrol 2,000 meters into uncontested enemy ground, a known Viet Cong infiltration route, and set his ambush. Then the whole thing reversed on him. It was not one group of Viet Cong that came, but 3, and they did not spring the trap. They kept arriving and kept setting up, in the dark, around a squad that suddenly had nowhere to go. According to his Silver Star citation, Marcinko's men were surrounded by 85 armed Viet Cong for more than 4 hours. Say that again slowly. A squad, surrounded, by 85, for 4 hours, in the swamp, in the dark. They should not have lived through it. What kept them alive was not the shotgun and not the rifle. It was discipline, and radios, and the nerve to call fire down almost on top of themselves. Marcinko had artillery stand by, and he walked airstrikes onto the Viet Cong within 300 meters of his own position, close enough to feel the ground jump. And when the enemy finally began pulling back toward the Cambodian border, he did the one thing that 85 against 6 arithmetic says you must never do. He attacked. He led his squad straight into a group of 43 retreating Viet Cong, working his M60 machine gun, breaking their last attempt to flank the squad and finish it. At first light, the sweep told the story in numbers. 24 Viet Cong killed, 41 wounded, 6 automatic weapons captured, 1 SKS rifle left in the grass. Bundles of hot food and clothing dropped within 20 meters of the ambush site by men who had run without stopping to carry them. The squad walked out. All of it. This is the reality underneath the title, and it is stranger and harder than any exaggeration. The Viet Cong did not come to fear the SEALs because a shotgun could slam fire. They feared them because 85 men could surround 6 in the dark, on ground of their own choosing, and still lose. The enemy put a price on Marcinko personally for it, 50,000 piastres for his death. And it was not the last time the math ran that way. 2 years later, on the 9th of April 1970, in Long Phu district of Ba Xuyen province, a chief gunner's mate named Barry Enoch was leading a combined American and Vietnamese SEAL patrol hunting Viet Cong leadership. Enoch spotted 6 armed VC trying to slip away. He rushed them alone, into their fire, and accounted for 3 of them before the rest of the enemy force opened up with B-40 rockets and automatic weapons and closed a ring around the patrol. Enoch did not carry a shotgun that day. He carried a stoner, a belt-fed light machine gun, and that detail matters because the SEALs were never shotgun mystics. They carried whatever the fight in front of them demanded. Surrounded, his radio shot to pieces by enemy fire, Enoch walked airstrikes in as close as 20 meters from his own men. Then he called a strike straight down the shortest line between his position and the river and led the entire patrol out through the gap it tore open before the enemy could close it. Every man came home. Barry Enoch was awarded the Navy Cross. The Viet Cong gave these men the name themselves, Linh Mac San, the men with the green faces. After the camouflage paint they wore into the night. It was not a compliment. It is the name you give a thing you cannot predict and cannot stop. Documents and interviews from the other side describe the same reaction over and over. Supply routes shifted onto smaller canals, standing bounties, and a plain refusal to move at night in the areas where the green-faced men were known to work. In 7 years, by the SEAL community's own count, this tiny force, rarely more than 120 men on the ground at any one time, accounted for roughly 600 confirmed Viet Cong killed. 46 SEALs died in Vietnam across the whole war. None were captured. None were left behind. But the shotgun that helped build the legend had hard limits, and the men who carried it understood them better than anyone. Its range was pitiful. Past 30 or 40 yards, the pattern opened up, and the killing power bled away to nothing. It held only 4 or 5 rounds, and thumbing shells back into a tube magazine one at a time in the middle of a firefight was an eternity. And in the early years, the old paper shotgun shells swelled in the wet Delta air until they jammed the action solid, a curse that only lifted when plastic-hulled buckshot arrived. The shotgun was a specialist tool for a specialist's range. Step outside that range and you wanted the stoner, or the M16, or the machine gun. The SEALs were deadly precisely because they never fell in love with a single weapon. They picked the one that fit the ground. When you ask the men who were there what they remember, almost none of them talk about specifications. They talk about the weight of wet clothes at 2 in the morning, the cold of the canal, the way a duckbill going off in a confined space did not sound like a gun at all, the face of the man beside them. Watson's shotgun, the one he called Sweetheart, sits today in the Navy SEAL Museum in Florida. Cut down, magazine extended, duckbill still fitted, exactly the way he carried it. And somewhere in the memory of the men who fought against them, there is still a tree line in the Delta, and a small patrol coming through the mud with green faces and strange short weapons. It looked like the easiest kill of the war. It was the last mistake a great many of them ever made. The men with the green faces never needed the shotgun to be magic. They only needed it to work at the range where they did their killing. And it did. If this one was worth your time, YouTube thinks you're going to want the video on your screen right now. Go ahead and give it a look.